Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. Thank you for tuning in. Today is going to be a quick one on how to make a half body. So please just stay tuned. Be sure to like and leave your comments on maybe there's anything that you want me to work on or anything that I missed. I'll be looking at you for your comment. Thank you for tuning in. So the first thing I'm doing is just to write out the measurements that I'm going to be using. I'm also going to put that on the screen for you to see. So the pattern paper that I'm using, I've already divided it into two. One is going to be for the front bodice, while another one will be for the back bodice. Remember, we are cutting the half bodice from the shoulder to the half length, which is the smallest part of the waist. Now, the first thing I'm doing is I'm going to get my half of my shoulder measurement and I'm going to put it there. Now, where that line is going to be the fold, where the fold of the fabric will be. So definitely you can cut this bodice on a fabric directly. So after measuring half of my shoulder measurements, I'll go down by 1 inch from that line, and then I'll go back to where the center is and I'll measure 3 inches. So half of my shoulder measurement is 8. I've measured that, went down by 1 inch, then went back to the center and measured 3 inches. So I'm now going to use a slanting line to join from that 3 inches to where I came down by 1 line to form the shoulder slant. So now from that place I came down by 1 inch, I'll come down by 8 inches so that I can draw the angle of the shoulder of the armhole. Now notice that I'm using half of my armhole as also the shoulder half of my as the shoulder armhole angle. Now this works perfectly for me. I don't know about anybody, but using half of my shoulder measurement as the armhole angle works perfectly for me. Obviously you can adapt this any way that you want. So I'm just making sure that I have 8 inches exactly, so I'm not unintentionally adding to the measurement. So I'm just drawing a straight line like that, and then I've created the angle for the armhole. So I haven't created the angle for the armhole. Now I can now measure where the half body stops. So my own half body stops at 17. So you can get somebody to measure you so that you know exactly where your half body stops. And I always advise that if you are starting out as a tailor, get a professional to measure you and make sure that the tape that they measured you with is what you always use for your clothes, so that you are not adding or subtracting from the measurements unintentionally. So shoulder to my half waist, to my waist, as the half length is 17 inches. You're going to add 1 inch to this if you are cutting directly on the fabric, but since I'm using a pattern paper, I'm not adding 1 inch. If I'm going to be cutting on the fabric, I'm going to add 1 inch for joining. And then I'm going to proceed now to add my bust points measurements, my under bust measurement. Also, again, advise you that you have a professional tailor take your measurements so that you have accurate measurements, and then the tape measure that was used to take your measurements is what you should also use to draw your pattern or on your fabric. So my bust point there, I've measured it, which is 12, and then my under bust is 13, is 15 rather. Under bust is 15. So I have that now, and I just quickly went ahead to label everything so that it's easy for you to know what is what. Now I'm going to check where half of that armhole angle is so that I can create the armhole curve, and then after determining half of it, I'll go in by half an inch from that line, determine half of from that apex of the shoulder to the angle to where the angle stops, determine half of it, then go in by half an inch as you can see me do, and then just create the armhole curve like I'm doing. I didn't know at some point that you could use that inner part of the armhole curve, but then we learn every day. After watching a series of YouTube videos, I realized that inner part of that curve is easier to draw the curve. Of course, you can use your free hand to carefully just trace this out if you don't have a curved ruler. And now I'll proceed to put quarter of my bust measurement, which is 9.25, and then I'll go down to my waist and put quarter of my waist measurement. I'm not of those people that say that you have to add half of your under bust measurement. Whatever it is that I'm using for my waist measurements usually suffices for my bust under bust round measurements. So just, I don't know, for me, I'm not going to put it. I'm just going to put my quarter of my bust measurement and quarter of my waist measurement and call it a day. Now let's add the dart. For the dart, I'm going to measure my nipple to nipple measurement divided by 2 plus half an inch. My nipple to nipple measurement is 8, divided by 2 is 4, plus half an inch, that's 4.5. So I'm going to measure that from the center of the clothes up to where, up to 1 inch below the bust point. So for that 4.5 inches, I'm going to measure it from down from my waist up to 1 inch below the bust point measurement, so that my dart is not entering the bust point area. So after measuring this, now I'll go back to the waist. I'm just going to measure half an inch on either side of that to create the dart leg, and I'll join it. So you can easily transfer this to your fabric if you are using pattern to cut yours out, or even on the fabric, just find a way of measuring that dart leg correctly. Now I'm going to add 2 inches for my sewing allowance. Now if you are somebody that you always use lining to turn, you had 2.5 inches, but I don't usually use lining to turn, so I just had 2 inches. Now on the waist, remember that you've already taken 1 inch for the dart. Be sure to add that 1 inch back plus the 2 inches that is going to be your sewing allowance, and you are more or less done. But before we call it a day, we can just add the neck depth. The neck depth I'm using is 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. You can adapt this however you want, but please make sure that the least you can go down, or the shortest depth you can use, is 3 inches. So for an adult bodice, always make sure that you start from 3 inches for the neck depth, and the neck width also 3 inches. 3 by 3 is the standard measurement, so anything from there you can start adopting it for the neck hole. Now we are done with the front. We are going to go to the back bodice. But before we draw the back bodice, first of all, I'm going to measure 2 inches from that center line. I'm using the same pattern. Obviously, if you are using a fabric too, this is very easy to follow. Just measure 2 inches. That 2 inches is going to form my zipper allowance. So after measuring that 2 inches, now I'm going to measure half of my shoulder measurements, just like I did for the front. Also come down by 1 inch, then measure 3 inches, which is the standard, and then just draw a slant line from that 3 inches to where I came down by 1 inch. Where I came down by 1 inch, I come down by 8 inches again, and just check on both sides to make sure that I have the accurate measurements, and then I can draw the armhole angle. At this point, I realized that my pattern paper wasn't going to be enough to add the sewing allowance. So of course, make sure that you factor in your sewing allowance when you're putting your fabric on fold. So there I've measured from my shoulder measurements to where my waist measurement is going to stop. Now I'm putting the armhole, and I came down by half from the apex of the shoulder and just use the curve to join it. It doesn't need to have the depth that the front arm will have. Now I'm measuring quarter of my waist measurement, quarter of my bust measurement, and just join with a straight line. Now let's add the dart. So add the dart. I'm going to draw a straight line across where the chest measurement is, which is where the arm hole stops, chest measurements, and then I'll just measure half of that, my bust to nipple measurements plus half an inch. Then I'll come down by 1 inch, and that's where my dart is going to stop. Come down by 1 inch from the chest line with that. So that's where my dart is going to stop. Then I'll just measure half an inch on either side of that 4.5 inch, and then I'll just join to where the dart stops, and I'm done. Now I realize that my pattern paper is not going to be enough to add the sewing allowance. Please don't be like me. So just indicate on those sides what the sewing allowance is going to be, so that when you are cutting it, once you see it, you know what you are doing, and you don't have to worry about making any mistakes. Now for the neck depth and neck width, I'm going to use 1.5 inch for the neck depth, and for the neck width I'll use the same thing that I used for the front. So the neck width has to match with the front, but the neck depth doesn't have to be the same thing. But the least you can go down for the neck depth is going to be 1 inch. Now for the zip allowance, on the neck depth area I'm going to measure 1 inch, and on the waist area I'm going to measure 0.75. 1 inch on the neck round area, and then 0.75 on the waist area, and join with a slanting line. Now I'm going to go up by 1 inch at that middle of the back, and you can see that I've created this line. Just go up by 1 inch and then draw it across. So basically I'm done with that back measurement also, and now I'm just going to cut it out for you to see what it looks like. this is what the bodice is going to look like when you're done. Thank you for tuning in. Bye for now.